course, I immediately point out the question is flawed because it presumes that we're the ones inspiring this, rather than why is hatred directed at atheists?
Yeah.
Because then it could be our fault or their fault or a combination. So asking the wrong questions is probably one of the biggest problems in the world right now. But they had a panel on to discuss it. How many atheists were on that panel? None.
Really?
Not one. 2 Christians and a Jew to explain to the world that atheists were just really bad at PR,
right,
and that we didn't have any morals to live by.
My sense is, by the way, and again, I mean this is a positive, my sense even in this country is that a lot of the religious leaders, they don't quite want to tell you what they really believe, which is a step in the right direction. And my impression still is that most of them know that the culture has shifted or is shifting significantly enough that they know that some of the things they might believe or might have claimed 20 years ago have become total landmines for them.
So here's what we'll do. You come down to Austin, we'll take a drive to San Antonio, and you can listen to John Hagee, who runs one of the biggest churches in the United States, talk about how nasty atheists are, and if they don't like God's country, they can get out of the United States, boy.
He must be about the only one who hasn't been caught with a rent boy. Haven't they all, almost all? And I notice any, and late friend Christopher Hitchens used to have a great riff on this, that you know, whenever you saw any of them holding forth on moral issues, you just make a note, and before you knew it, you'd find they'd maxed out the credit card trying to pay some rent boy,
The scandals are
almost consistent rule.
So
I'm amazed Hagee, I don't know what the laws of defamation are like in this country, but I'm amazed Hagee is already not.
Yeah, well, and he's just one of many examples. There's some that are, and this is another problem with the internet. There's a pastor, I'm not even going to bother saying his name, because he's already gotten too much publicity. Tiny church, and yet broadcasts over the internet, which gets him all kind of attention, mostly from atheists who want to just say, "Oh my gosh, this guy is terrible." I don't know what percentage of church-going Christians actually care what this guy says, but he's awful with regard to women and everything else. But when clearly there's going to be differences. I wonder if how much of the differences that we're seeing are actually related to differences in culture. Because I have some rather troubling questions related to culture. And as you've spoken a lot about issues related to multiculturalism, I figured maybe we could address some of that, because what does it mean to say British culture, Western culture? Is there even enough uniformity of value for that to be a meaningful phrase? And what is it that we should be worried about losing if that's diluted?
Yeah, that's a huge one. We're all trying to think about this at the moment. And there are versions of it that sound nicer than others.
From clergy scandals to firebrand preachers, religion's public face is evolving faster than a chameleon in a disco. Traditional religious leaders tiptoe around cultural landmines, while internet-savvy pastors spew controversy like confetti. Meanwhile, atheists find themselves under the microscope, dissected by panels ironically devoid of non-believers. This religious roller coaster raises thorny questions. What defines Western culture? Are we losing something vital as diversity increases? Or is this just the growing pains of a society grappling with its identity in a rapidly changing world?
Some are horrific. We have this big discussion now, what is our culture, what is Britishness, and every country in Europe is having that discussion, and I hear it here, I hear it in Canada, sort of constant self-examination. There's nothing wrong with that in a way, although it can cause what I regard as being a kind of breakdown. I mean, if you said to any individual all the time, who are you, what are you, you'd end up on the couch quite fast. And I think it might be the same for societies. If you just keep asking what you are rather than just getting on with it, you can kind of instigate an increased nervousness.
I think my instinct is to not care.
Right.
I'm happy to adopt whatever labels apply to me and to explain what those labels are, but there's nothing about me. This actually bothered my wife a little bit when I said so, because she's a little more, she cares a lot more about her heritage and her history and the people from,
Right.
you know, the Appalachian Mountain or the Smoky Mountains and things like that, and what those people have gone through. And I don't want to be just dismissive of history, but you know, one of my ancestors was the preacher who was the founder of one of the first 3 Baptist churches that became the Southern Baptist Convention. And apart from it being novel, I don't care about that.
Right.
But there are also people in my past and cultural ties I could make that I would be, that I don't view as negatives,
Right.
but they're not me.
No, but there's another French philosopher, Alain Finkielkraut, who recently said in an interview something I was very struck by. He said, we in France used to think that what we had was worth taking around and giving to the rest of the world. And then we retreated from that idea. And he said, now we're in a position of thinking, can we at least still have it for ourselves? And I was struck by that because, again, it might be a thing of, you know, depending where you are and what you've seen, but I given some of the things that France has gone through in recent years, some of which I write about in the book, you know, multiple really terrible terrorist attacks and assassinations and so on, I can see why they are getting nervous and wanting to address some very fundamental principles. You know, is what we have in the secular French state, which allows for religion, but you know now is dealing with new problems, is it all vulnerable? And I know a lot of people who feel it is. And I suppose another thing, I mean, I spend a lot of my life as a journalist traveling, not just, you know, across this country and North America and across all of Europe, but the Middle East, the Far East, and Africa, and so on. And there is a definite feeling you get in certain places of, well, I don't want to force my own view of my own society on this, but this is very different, and it reminds you, therefore, that what you have is unusual. And I suppose that at different times, people become more aware of how, gotta be careful how you say this, but how lucky we may be in this country and in the country I'm from, for instance, that we're even within this discussion and freely able to have it and so on, and that some things down the road might stop that being the case. So I think that there are moments when societies become kind of febrile like that.
Nations are caught in a cultural identity crisis, frantically asking, who are we, like teenagers at a philosophy slam? From France's cultural retreat to individual apathy about heritage, the spectrum is vast. This societal soul-searching, while potentially neurosis-inducing, highlights the uniqueness of open societies. As we navigate this minefield of multiculturalism and tradition, the challenge lies in appreciating our roots without being strangled by them. The goal? Maintaining our cultural distinctiveness while avoiding the trap of xenophobic navel-gazing.
Let me give an example. I mean, if any of you have ever been mugged or seen something terrible on the street, you know,
We're in New York.
so it changes the way you look at people for quite some time afterwards, and maybe forever.
Yes.
If you've seen anything really brutal in the middle of a sophisticated, cultivated place, it will fundamentally change the way you look at everything afterwards and the way you look at people. And, you know, this is the case with conflict zones, war zones I've been in. You know, it's not just that you come back from those places thinking, my God, I've got an idea of how lucky we are to have this settlement we have, but also why people who are from such places have put it this way, have one less layer of skin than everyone else and feel certain things early. And that's the case in certain countries in the West at the moment, and that's partly what this book is about, that certain countries, France being one, are really reevaluating some of this because they are seeing futures that they want to avoid.
I can see that. First of all, I recognize that, you know, there are people who are going to have experiences that are going to change the way they view things. That doesn't change whether or not their view is accurate.
Sure.
But when it comes to this idea that we need to protect our culture, whatever it is, from some other culture, that just doesn't seem to resonate with me for any reason, because maybe it's because I'm the standard generic privileged white American dude who doesn't care that much about his past, but I view things in terms of there are right answers and wrong answers to how to do things. And different views of what was right and wrong have existed in different cultures.
Sure.
But we know that some of them were wrong. I don't think either one of us is remotely a moral relativist.
Sure.
That is the thing that I want to hold to. What I view as the value of secular humanism, the value of basic freedoms. If I have a town and a bunch of people start moving to my town and they're bringing their cultural stuff, I don't have any fear that they're going to kill off my culture, because anything that's worth value to me, I'm going to protect anyway. And I advocate for the freedom for them to engage in and support and value their culture, right up to the extent that it impedes on the secular, reasonable, scientific founded, laws and things.
It's
like
like a boundary beating.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got to beat these boundaries quite hard, allow a lot to go on within it. But yes, and once certain lines are crossed, you've got to take a stronger view on it. That, by the way, I mean, I hark on about it. It may not be of much interest, but this is why France obsesses me, because within 1 year...
Traumatic experiences can strip away our cultural skin, leaving us raw and hypersensitive to societal shifts. Yet, this heightened awareness doesn't always translate to accuracy. The challenge lies in maintaining a delicate balance, embracing cultural diversity while fiercely guarding core values like secular humanism and scientific reasoning. It's a high-stakes cultural tightrope walk where we must welcome the new without letting go of the essential. The goal? A society that's both open and principled, diverse yet cohesive, a tall order for any cultural mixologist.
They had the massacre at Charlie Hebdo, most satirical, secular, atheist paper. They had the massacre of most of the staff of that magazine, and also a priest beheaded at the altar in Rouen as he was saying Mass. If that extremity of things can happen in a culture in quite a short space of time, that is the sort of thing that would return you to the fundamental questions. And as I say, one of the fundamental questions all the time is what we have the sort of natural default position of humankind, or is it a pretty unusual thing caused by quite unusual factors? And I, at any rate, take the second view, and therefore think that from the secular tradition and others, you've got to be aware of it, at the very least, to make sure you don't piss it away.
I think one of the things that this is another difference from two sides of the pond, and we talked about this very briefly, is that people will contact me on the show and say, "Oh, you spend all your time talking about Christianity. That's all you talk about, Christianity. Why would you do that?" Because it's a call-in show, and that's what people are calling in about. First of all, it's also my background. Well, you don't talk to us about Islam at all. And I was like, well, actually, we have many times, and there are occasionally Muslim callers. There's one of them who I'm fairly sure I made cry, even though that wasn't my intent. But we address those things, and yet the thing that I keep trying to point out to people is that while I might agree that when it comes to religions worldwide, Islam might be the single most dangerous ideas and be the greatest risk worldwide, but that doesn't mean it's the greatest risk in the United States or in Texas or in Austin. Sure. And you've spoken a great deal about Islam, and I think that there are different things going on in the UK that we don't see here. I mean, Muslims in the United States, I mean, apart from the general fear that has been instilled in everybody, which I think is at least exaggerated for us, but I couldn't say that for everybody. There are Muslims in Dearborn that are, drinking and getting tattoos, and they've been, that their version of Islam has been poisoned probably for the good by the secular and perhaps even Christian culture that they're surrounded with.
I once was with a pretty devout Muslim friend, and he'd been fasting for Ramadan, and he broke the fast with me in a pub with a pint of beer, which I thought was a happy meshing of cultures.
And so when we see these changes, and granted, I don't know, and you're free to tell us what we don't know about how things are much more in conflict with regard to people trying to impose their version of Sharia law in conflict with UK laws. And
yeah, there is some of that, and some of it's exaggerated, but a lot of it is real and is there. And I mean, I give the example of the de facto blasphemy law that now exists across Europe.
Cultural integration, a transatlantic game of whack-a-mole. While America's Bible Belt tightens, Europe's secular fabric frays under Islamic pressure. France's bloody wake-up calls, from satirical slaughter to altar beheadings, force existential questions. Is our cherished humanism humanity's default, or just a fleeting anomaly? Meanwhile, American Muslims break Ramadan fast with beer as Europe grapples with de facto blasphemy laws. Now, it's a stark reminder, cultural assimilation isn't a one-size-fits-all recipe.
I mean, it's not just Charlie Hebdo. Quite a number of colleagues and friends have been shot at in recent years for blaspheming Islam, and that's in 21st century Europe, and it's something which I, at any rate, and a number of other people refuse to shut up about, because we think it's intolerable that should be the situation. And the oddity of that is that, you know, if there were to be anyone who decided to kill Michael Palin tomorrow because of the life of Brian, I strongly urge this is not something I think should happen.
Yes.
But if that were to happen, the whole culture, everything would turn on whoever did that. There would be no ifing and butting. There'd be no kind of, well, you've got to understand the offense he caused. You know, we'd just be saying no. And that isn't the case with this other religion in this situation, partly because people are worried about allegations of bigotry, partly because they're worried that, you know, it's kind of punching down, and one of the motifs of the time on this, and that you might be upsetting a beleaguered minority and so on. But a third of UK Muslims polled after the Charlie Hebdo attacks said that they had some sympathy with the attackers. A third. You know, I happen to be gay, and you know, I'm not delighted by some of the attitudes you can still hear from churches here about homosexuality. But, you know, in my own country, there was a poll in 2009 that found among British Muslims 0% thought that you should be tolerant towards homosexuality. And a poll taken 2 years ago found that the majority of British Muslims wanted being gay to be made illegal now. So that's the sort of thing where you just start to worry. Okay, we've seen this off from one direction. What if it comes in another? And what if it benefits and gains from the fact that people are basically not primed to deal with it anymore?
There's a documentary on Netflix, because I watch tons of documentaries on Netflix, especially when I'm on the road, and it's called Welcome to Leith. And it is about a bunch of Nazis or neo-Nazis who moved to a town somewhere in, I don't know, Wyoming, Montana, someplace, and essentially tried to take it over.
Right.
And it's really eye-opening, because it makes you wonder, well, what would happen if they tried to do this in my town? Now, it would take a lot of them to take over, you know, Austin or New York or whatever, but in a small town, if you had a massive group of people show up with a particularly dangerous ideology, such that they could actually take over the city council, that they would become the dominant voting bloc.
Right.
What protections do you have?
Right.
In this case, I'm interested in we're looking at exploring this as a project. There are a number of towns that have been taken over by religious ideologies. There are towns that are almost exclusively Mormon or Hasidic Jew, and I have concerns about the constitutional rights of the individuals who live in those towns. Sure. Because in the States, the default is, oh, well, that, you know, you really can't have any power.
in Europe's cultural minefield, blasphemy against Islam invites violence. Fear of bigotry accusations mutes responses, despite polls showing troubling support for regressive views. This echoes scenarios where extreme ideologies could dominate small towns, threatening individual rights. Balancing cultural sensitivity with steadfast rights protection is crucial. It's a high-stakes game of ideological chess, where the wrong move could cost societal harmony.
Because we've got the Constitution and it's there to protect us. And as a reminder, you can in fact run for office anywhere in the United States if you're an atheist. Please stop spreading around that thing of my state constitution says you must believe. Yes, that was all settled by the Supreme Court in the 50s and then fought a couple other times as well. But you can run for office. But we had to fight it in court just to show what the Constitution says. And if they could take over a town, I get why people are terrified of that. Wouldn't it be a more practical solution? I don't know how this applies in the UK, but to just make sure that our laws are such that people can exercise their religious freedom, but they can't, there's the old joke about the Constitution, two wolves and a sheep are arguing over what's for dinner. And the Constitution, or the democracy, is what allows them all to vote, and the Constitution is what guarantees that the sheep's not going to be dinner. And it seems that we can enforce those ideas so that people can have their preferred culture, provided it can coexist with the surroundings.
The moment that's what we're really struggling with across Europe at the moment, is to work out where the moments are where you tread over the rights of others in a way that's unacceptable, and also then what you do about it. Because this is, it's a dialogue of the demented at the moment, where the society says, there are some things we really strongly believe in, and if you don't believe in them, well, please do. It's not very assertively made. There's a sort of, well, what happens if I don't? Well, please do. There's no follow-up.
It starts to look like war and conflict, physical violence ends up being inevitable if you can't come to a reasonable...
Yes, and some people do fear that's the case. I don't take as apocalyptic a view as that, but there's a long way for this to run, and it doesn't all go in a good direction.
I know that I have probably 50,042 questions left for you, so we'll have to continue another time. But I've also noticed that it's been shockingly almost an hour, even though it feels like 20 minutes.
Can I ask a question of you?
You can.
You
may.
I spent, sorry to walk into your Q&A time, but I spent part of this morning watching your event with Jordan Peterson a couple of days ago. I'm doing some events with him in London coming up. And I was fascinated by it. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about it that I might have missed. Has anyone here seen it? Well, probably quite a few people, It's an amazing conversation, I think. And
I put out a video on my Atheist Debates channel, giving most of my thoughts to it. I am still confused and more than a little irritated.
Right.
Because I know that he had conversations with Sam Harris, and the first one was awful and painful because they couldn't come to some understanding about what truth was. And for me, truth is that which comports with reality. Done.
In the US, the Constitution shields against religious overreach, even allowing atheists to run for office, despite persistent myths. Yet fears of extremist takeovers linger. The remedy? Laws that balance religious freedom with rights protection. Europe grapples with this, risking conflict without firm action. Dialogues with thinkers like Jordan Peterson expose ongoing confusion about truth, underscoring the complexity of cultural debates.
Or at least that's the truth I care about. Once we start talking about, oh, well, it's true for me, or it's true in a metaphorical sense, I realize that you can inspire people and even educate them with analogies and stories and things, but I care about whether something's really true. There's a gentleman that messaged me on Twitter, and he's written a big piece about this thing that I did with Jordan because he thinks I'm just monumentally wrong about what people actually believe about the existence of God. And he's like, most people, who believe that God exists don't actually believe that God exists. And I just think that's monumentally arrogant and dismissive. How dare you? I mean, there are probably people who have a metaphorical view of God that's fine for them, or that they believe in, but I know what I grew up with. I know what's popular and evangelical and fundamentalist. If you go up to them and say you don't actually believe that there's a God, you'll find out fairly quickly that they are at least willing to defend the idea that they do.
They might even thump you for Jesus.
They might, yeah. Punch me in my fat face for Jesus. That was one of my favorite threats. But when I look back at the discussion, there were things that I loved about it in the sense that we were, it's frustrating to me that I can sometimes have conversations with people I disagree with much more easily than I can with, for example, some of my friends on the left who've decided that because I'm not willing to punch people for saying things that are awful, that I'm a Nazi sympathizer and will go out of their way to say this.
Right.
So it's frustrating because I disagree with, I don't think Jordan values skepticism. He kind of scoffed at it under his breath. And I wish I would have addressed that more. I think that's the biggest regret from the conversation that I have. But I was happy with that we didn't spend a whole bunch of time talking about truth, except that it concerns me that with the fuzziness of how he talks about it, that maybe every single objection I had can be dismissed by saying, well, he didn't mean that true in reality. When he says you can't quit smoking without a mystical experience, that atheists would actually be murderers.
The reference to crime and punishment.
Yes.
I thought that was very interesting, yeah.
I'm still not convinced of what he believes about the reality that we, as far as I can tell, share. But to say that Soviet Russia was a secular humanist...
I could see that was a bit that really got on your tits.
It did. Because you can say it's atheist, and I'll agree all day long. And it was all, you could also say that it was, you could try to make an argument that it was because of atheism, but you can't really get anywhere from atheism to therefore we should kill people and have this particular, you might as well start with his mustache and say, mustachioed dictators are awful.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating, and it was really interesting, the points at which you really were clearly at loggerheads. One was that issue. A thought occurred to me, though, that Jordan clearly has a pretty bleak, you might say, realistic view of human nature and what it does when it's unleashed. And I share some of that. But it's possible that was one of the things that was playing out underneath that claim of his.
Truth aligns with reality, not metaphorical musings. Evangelicals staunchly defend God's existence, often underestimated by skeptics. Dialogues with figures like Jordan Peterson highlight challenges in skepticism and truth definition. Missteps like equating Soviet atheism with secular humanism derail discourse. The real task? Bridging ideological divides without resorting to dismissive frustration or polarized assumptions. It's a delicate dance of ideas, where clarity and understanding are the ultimate goals.
Which is, you sometimes see this, by the way, among very conservative people, that they come to quite rigid feelings about things because they actually themselves intuit where they might go unleashed. And that seemed to me to be sort of abundantly there in what he was saying. And I find his attitude towards religion fascinating. He reminds me of the philosopher Roger Scruton a bit, because the Scruton, I think he's written a lot about religion, but I think that if you really dug down and you said to him, for instance, do you believe in the physical resurrection? He would want to not answer that question.
And that's what
I think that's where Jordan is as well. And I'm not putting any views onto him that I think are dishonest, but I think that he has a real fear of saying something which he thinks would cause damage in a way if he did it.
Well, that's the one question that I asked him that I had prepared ahead of time based on what I knew, and that was, What is it that you fear we will lose if people give up a belief in a God? And he started with, well, we'll lose the narrative, the metaphorical substrate of the narrative, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't tell me anything, because it doesn't tell me what of the narrative is of value that we're losing.
Right.
And then when I pressed on that, he just said art, as if there's not, well, the problem is that I could say there's tons of art from atheists, except that he also doesn't seem to think there are any atheists.
Right.
He thinks everyone is religious and that people are just professing atheism, but they've made, none of this meshes with, certainly it reminds me when I'm in debates with Christian apologists and they say, oh, you're not really an atheist, you actually are just publicly denying that you exist, you believe in a God, or you actually know that a God exists. And that comes from, I mean, I did a debate with Cy ten Bruggencate, who's a presuppositionalist, and that's his big thing. We all know that God exists, including you, you're just lying or whatever. And he's mocked for it. And yet in reality, Jordan did exactly the same thing, essentially saying, you all you atheists are professing atheists that, a real atheist would be a cold-blooded killer who would, rationalize and justify this way. You can't have a moral foundation that is secular. And he tried to use AI. Anyway, I don't want to go through the whole evening, but it was essentially the same thing I get from unschooled, uneducated apologists on behalf of a much more strict view of religion. And that's why earlier, you may be right about what he's afraid of. And I tried to get to what he's afraid of. But when you were talking about suggesting that we may have lost something and encouraging people to go back to church for that, I didn't know how similar those things were. I think there's a difference.
I'm slightly towards his direction. Some of that. I mean, I don't want to belabor this, but just one example. A little while ago, after a talk, a young man, a student, came over to ask a question afterwards, and he said, this was a real warning flash, you'll know this. He said, I don't understand why you don't talk about IQ differentials.
Conservative rigidity often masks fear of their own unleashed potential, a theme in dialogues with Jordan Peterson. His evasive stance on religious beliefs mirrors Roger Scruton. When pressed on losing God, Peterson cited vague narratives, echoing unschooled apologists claiming atheists secretly know God. These debates expose deep fears and narratives, but sidestep crucial questions about the true value of belief. It's a dance of ideas, leaving much unsaid.